Hi, everybody. This is the Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley. And every week we bring you stories of people who are finding all sorts of interesting and innovative ways to improve communities locally, globally, and digitally. The Rotary E-Club of Silicon Valley is a part of Rotary International, 1.4 million Rotarians and Rotaractors around the world, 36,000 or more clubs. These are folks you want to get to know if you're not in Rotary. And so if you're kind of like, who are these people? Take a look at rotary.org. Or if you're specifically interested in our club and the cool things we do, you go to rotary.cool. No, really, you do. So anyway, that is who we are. And we happen to have with us a speaker today who is a mechanical engineer. She has been VP and headed up different companies. She is a venture capitalist. She has run for Congress. And she's fascinating to talk to. So that was one of the reasons I said, hey, would you have any interest in talking to the Rotary Club of Silicon Valley? And very kindly, she said yes. So if you are interested in the longer description of her bio, and you are on the SiliconValleyRotary.com page, then pause, scroll up, and read that bio that you missed the first time. If you are on our YouTube page, pause, scroll down, and you'll see the bio right there. Regardless of where it is you go to read this bio, or even if you don't, we are really happy, Shrina, to have you, and I hand the mic over to you. Welcome to the Rotary Club of Silicon Valley.
Thank you so much, Rustin, and the rest of the group for having me today. Really, really excited to be here. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So thanks again. I'm really excited to share more about my vision and perspective for my firm, SNØCAP. So let's get into it. We're here to talk about climate change, right? When we think about the conditions here on Earth that have allowed us to make strides forward in terms of tackling poverty, creating a sustainable food supply, improving health outcomes, it very quickly becomes clear how interlinked we all are. We can't talk about health without talking about air and water quality, about food without resources and inputs like nutrients and water. We have to take the blinders off and break down the silos and really focus on systemic solutions. One of my favorite papers, and one of the first papers I read when I was first entering the sustainability space now about a decade ago, talks about planetary boundaries, from fresh water use to land use change. There are tipping points beyond which it's not as simple just to say the world's going to burn if we don't fix this. But we enter into territory that becomes uncertain, like driving too fast without your seatbelt on. So by surpassing these planetary boundaries, we chip away at our insurance mechanisms. So our focus at SNØCAP is not just to think about these systems, but to actually help build new systems the right way. We're focused on joining forces and finding these pathways to not only identify the solutions, but actually help scale them. And I think now is the perfect time to share a little bit more about the other star talent we have on our team, because it is definitely not just me. My name is Shrina Kurani. I am a mechanical engineer. My very first engineering project was with NASA, designing a lunar outpost on the south side of the moon. And I learned more about heat transfer and renewable energy systems, earned my master's in Sweden in sustainability. And after helping start a few companies in the climate tech space in food and water, I joined a venture capital firm out of the Bay Area in Oakland, focusing on sustainability. I met Nate, who is a fellow mechanical engineer and also co-founder of SNØCAP during this time, because he was building a climate sanctuary called Sweet Farm, incubating companies that needed access to land, and his skill sets having been in the climate tech space for about 13 years, including at Bill Gates' TerraPower. We kept in touch, and while I built out my next company, Republic, a fintech platform working to democratize access to capital, which has now facilitated over $1 billion in capital, I ran for Congress. And after my election, he reached out the very next day asking what my plans were. And our third partner is John Azoff, who joins us with over 15 years of deep operating experience as a software engineering leader with exits to Zillow and Disney. And he built out the investor services for Carta. So why are we excited about this? When we talk about building systems, it's not just here in California or even in the United States. Climate change is a global challenge, and we're seeing immense commitments from corporations to the tune of trillions of dollars. And now with the latest bills that have passed in the US, billions of dollars that are focusing on tackling this challenge. As we see market forces really forcing the hand of market actors, We're also seeing a response with increasing incentives to develop new sustainable technologies. So what we're excited about is how we think we can truly shift the conversation and development of the climate ecosystem. We're seeing these bi-directional incentives, which are exposing a gap in the funding landscape. I mean, think about it. Every time you go to the grocery store, whether you're buying furniture or even getting your car, all around us is this rise of increasing demand from consumers for green innovation. But when it comes to scale, these new sustainable end products and services are lacking inputs higher up in the supply chain, whether it's about batteries or materials or agricultural technology. So what we're focused on is what we call platform innovation. Platforms that generate products and processes that have a competitive advantage over their more carbon intensive counterparts. With more demand for products, we have to rapidly scale the sustainable inputs, which, if we're able to do that successfully, ultimately brings the cost down and builds new reduced emission supply chains and feeds back into more innovation for the end consumer. So what we're specifically leveraging is what we have that a lot of venture funds actually lack, which is teams that actually have technical understanding of deep technology. So from food, water, waste, industrial carbon, it's not just ripping and replacing technologies, but also enabling new product innovation. So let's look at an example with alternative protein. This technology, about a decade ago, was being laughed out of the room. It sounded like something out of a sci-fi movie. And whether you're fully bought in yet or not, the cost per kilogram, the reduction in that cost in just 7 years is astounding. A few years ago, even before plant-based meats have made their way onto drive-through menus, I had the chance to speak with the CEO of one of the largest privately held companies in the category. And I remember asking him what his biggest challenge would be. And he looked me dead in the eye and basically said, making enough of this damn stuff. And that's one of the challenges that we're facing across the board. The demand for climate-conscious consumer products has been growing, and making enough of this stuff has quickly become the bottleneck. But focusing on the end product alone doesn't necessarily solve the scale problem. It's a lot easier, at least sexier, to invest in the types of companies that we understand, the types of companies we interface with and buy from daily, these consumer-facing companies. And this is necessary, right? We need innovation at the bottom of the supply chain to help society transition from the high carbon footprint of our convenience-driven culture. But how do we enable the innovation that's actually required for this behavior change? What's our sustainable futures version of the combustion engine? So to maximize impact, we have to invest further up the supply chain where the less sexy, well, not to me, but the deeply scientific and the hard tech improvements can actually penetrate across consumer verticals and accelerate the transition that we need. For example, we're just looking at meat consumption as the previous example. In the US, it has doubled. More than doubled since when my parents were born. And the market share of electric vehicles in the US still is below 5%. And it's partly because, as that one food company CEO pushed, we need to make more of this stuff. The problems become more complex as we go higher up the supply chain, and the solutions can become more technical. But with our team, engineering is really our edge. There's a gap in funding because most firms don't have this technical expertise to actually understand and diligence deep technology opportunities. But we're seeing with the right types of support, we can take on additional risk of deep tech, of both the market as well as the research and development that actually allows companies to be truly innovative. So from the Paris Agreement to alternative proteins, policy and science are gaining momentum across the world. And what we're really doing here at SNØCAP is rolling up our sleeves and helping entrepreneurs rebuild supply chains for the sustainable revolution. And I will stop my share there. Thank you again for giving me a couple minutes to share more about what we're up to, and happy to hop into some Q&A.
Fantastic, Shrina. Thank you very much. I've got a list of questions over here. We're ready to jump into. I want to introduce the group that we have got on the screen. Before we do so, when I call your name, please wave at the camera. Feel free to smile if you're feeling that way today. Our guest in the club is actually one of the charter members of this club. His name is Chris, and while he is a proud member of the Canadian portion of the planet, he's currently in Florida. Chris, good to have you. From our club, our treasurer Cecilia, who is in Italy, our paella master Shags in Walnut Creek here in California, and I am in San Jose. My name is Rushton. I'm the programs chair. And it is good fun to be able to share these kinds of stories with our members, guests, and anyone else that they share it with. So, Shrina, to kind of jump into this, there are several different things that come to mind when I think about more environmentally sustainable approaches to to successful business. So it seems to me that you are talking about companies for which there is already an economic argument to move forward, rather than if only they had done this, this, and this, then they would be on par with the more traditional businesses. Is that something that is that tipping point something we've crossed more recently? I'm sure it's sector by sector dependent, but can you speak a little more as to timing with regard to why we're going from this is just a good thing to do for the planet to this is actually the good financial decision?
Yeah, of course. I think a big part of that actually comes down to generational change, right? We're beyond the time of Exxon hiding the fact that it knew about the impacts of what it was doing. And we're on to a time where the next generation is really trying to hold ourselves accountable, but is also demanding change from companies, right? We've seen companies shut down, lose out in the stock market. We're starting to see a lot of shifts in terms of consumer demand. And I think that really comes to terms with the fact that we're understanding more about the science, right? The term climate change, understanding carbon emissions, things like that has just become that much more mainstream. But we're also seeing the next generation sort of change the way that they want companies to behave and where they want their products and the things that they consume to actually come from. So I think a really big part of this is starting to come from the sort of updates in science and how mainstream this has all become, but also the next generation sort of demanding change.
So in that space, we're really talking about people's enthusiasm for the sector, right? Someone who is very excited about green. All right, this is green, right? However accurate that label may be for any given thing. Can you talk to a nuance that is often missing in the public discussion of this stuff? So you might hear somebody say, this is absolutely the future. It's completely, kind of environmentally friendly. And then someone on the other side who says, oh, no. The environmental impact of these renewable technologies is far greater than, and so you have this kind of thing. I mean, obviously, you look at what insurance companies are doing with regard to what kind of projects they'll fund, and it's clear which direction things are going. But when you think about the arguments related to environmental impact of renewable technologies, renewable approaches to agribusiness, and the kinds of things that you guys might be involved with, what are the deeper things that people should think about? Like it's like, okay, yes, in this time frame there is this kind of impact, but over this time there's not. I mean, how do you characterize that for a better discussion about moving towards environmentally sustainable business practice?
Of course, I actually love this question because the matter of fact is that it's complicated, right? Our supply chains have become so convoluted that when we talk about having your next car be an electric car, where is the lithium for that new battery coming from, right? And what are the conditions under which we're potentially mining, or all of the new materials that we need to develop this entire new phase of an electric revolution? Where is all that coming from, right? I think the consensus is clear in terms of we need to go away from fossil fuels, right? So we need to make sure that we're actually capping those emissions, but that doesn't mean that everything else we do in that space is okay. And one of the reasons why I love the question so much is because that's actually a big part of our thesis and our perspective in terms of what we need to actually have more innovation around is what are those material inputs? How can we actually make sure that we're mining in better ways? How can we make sure that we're actually getting and securing access to those resources, materials in ways that can actually be more sustainable? So whether you're talking about renewable technology, whether you're talking about nutrient inputs for agriculture, whether we're talking about how we're managing our waste, every single one of those supply chains is not perfect. And that's a part of the reason why we need to have innovation in those spaces. But it also means that at the very, very tops of those supply chains, we also need to make sure that we're actually adjusting those inputs. So I guess the short answer is that it's complicated. And the longer answer is that for each of these supply chains, we have an opportunity to actually build new supply chains and make sure that the inputs are already sustainable right from the very beginning.
All right. And, we had a speaker not too long ago who's working with a company in Scandinavia on helping shipping become more environmentally friendly by adding these very high-tech sails to existing container ships and things like that. To what extent, thinking about the businesses that SNØCAP supports, is the question of environmental sustainability really a function of shipping and transportation and how you get anything from place X to place Y?
Transportation is a big part of the sort of when you think about the carbon emissions pie. And I think that's a big part of how we're approaching sustainability is looking at each of the sectors that have larger than 1% share of that pie. And that includes transportation, includes shipping and logistics, it includes agriculture and our food systems. It sort of spans a lot of sectors that we don't often think about or necessarily directly associate with climate change. And all of those are sort of fair game for us. So we're really looking at what are the resources and inputs into each of these sectors, and how do we make sure that at the end of the day, we're going to reduce carbon emissions that's coming out, which means in a lot of cases, making them more efficient, right? So whether that's putting really cool, I saw that company, which is really, really awesome. Whether it's, putting high-tech sails on shipping containers or making sure that the way that we're growing certain crops in the field are better attuned to how they might be reacting to pests or to increase droughts or increase rainfall or changing temperatures or needing more nutrients or less nutrients. And it's not us just sort of dumping a bunch of stuff because it kind of works, but making sure that we're making that process as efficient as possible.
Cool. So some questions that are kind of showing up on the list about the companies that you support. We had a speaker quite recently from Umami Meats, in Singapore, right? And the work that they are doing to allow businesses to get the equipment they need to be able to do cultivated seafood, which is like, wow, that's interesting, right? That to me is the kind of story that allows someone to really think at much deeper levels about sustainability in business possibilities. Are there particular businesses, and perhaps it's hard not to mention one instead of all, but are there particular businesses that you learned about that made you enthusiastic about being part of SNØCAP, where it's like, oh my God, that company is doing what, right? Something along those lines.
Yeah, it's actually the place that we first met, Rushton, at Mission Barns.
Oh, that's right.
So that was a company that I led the sort of first larger investment into with my last firm, Better Ventures, and has an awesome relationship with Nate, one of our other partners, through Sweet Farm. And so I guess that's one other relationship to explain in terms of how we operate is, so Nate has Sweet Farm, which is this climate tech incubator that is supporting all sorts of companies in the very, very early stages and can support in a whole myriad of ways, right? A lot of what venture capitalists talk about when they are especially working at the pre-seed, seed stages, which is where we're investing at the early stages, is value add, right? How do you actually help these companies get off the ground? How do you really help them sort of take that next step, not just at the research phase, but really commercializing, taking on their first customers, understanding how they can actually enter this market that where the vision is to really take over an entire supply chain, right? And I think that's one of the beautiful parts about our relationship with Nate and with Sweet Farm is that we have land, right? We have the ability for when Mission Barnes is taking a cell sample from a pig to create an immortal cell line that it can create, food forever from, that pig is living happily ever after on Sweet Farm. Right. So I think there's these sort of incredible connections between not just investing in the technology, but acknowledging that this is having a very real world impact on our society, but also on these founders, on these companies and the types of technologies that they're trying to build. So I think that that's one sort of really great example of the way that we can invest in a company, but also sort of have it come around and create this incredible sort of heartwarming reaction to this absolutely adorable pig that is still, alive and happy and frolicking around on a farm.
Fair enough. We matter of fact, we've had Nate speak to us about Sweet Farm early in the pandemic. We connected via the GOAT2 meeting that I think your other partner was the mind behind, John Azoff, right? Right. Kudos to him for that. But a question that came in through the chat is one that I think gets us moving towards that topic, which is government action. Is it the case that government is, as I see it in the question, asleep at the wheel or asleep at the switch, or are there certain things government's doing at the moment that seem to move in a good direction for supporting what I assume you believe is the long-term financial benefit of investing in these kinds of companies?
So I have to stay optimistic because that's really all we have left. And I will say that I do think, especially in the US, but of course also following the COP since COP21 in Paris, and all the subsequent sort of negotiations, which have been a part of the past 4 or 5 or so, and there is an increasing urgency. Are we doing enough? No. That being said, we are really taking strides to actually, in my opinion, do what the government does best, right? It's not the government's job to necessarily act quickly in a lot of cases, right? We sort of rely on our governments by design to be stable and to not maneuver too quickly. And in my opinion, that's the purpose for the private sector, right? To be able to come in, to be more nimble, to be agile, to fail also, right? And then figure out what will actually work. And once we figure out what works, then let the public sector come in and implement and scale. So I think one of the things that the government is doing really well right now is actually investing heavily in the research, right? So if we look at all the federal funding that's coming in between the last 3 bills that were passed in this space, between the CHIPS Act, the bipartisan infrastructure law, and the, sorry, I'm blanking on the 3rd bill, but it's all come out to about $750 billion invested in climate across agriculture, across electrification, into hydrogen and nuclear, sort of across the board. And I think there's a real opportunity here to say, let's keep doing research. Let's continue innovating. Let's figure out what's actually working. Then let's let private sector come in, help bring up these companies to a certain point. Once we figure out what works, then let's scale it across the entire country and potentially across the entire world. So I think that's actually one of the areas where I think the government has been doing a really excellent job, is providing that really, really early research funding to make sure that we're focusing some of the brightest minds in this country to actually solve this problem. So I would say, what are we doing enough? No. However, I do think we're taking some really excellent steps forward in making sure that we're putting the money in the areas where we need it most and really focusing and incentivizing people to actually solve this problem.
All right, good. Cecilia, do you have a follow-up question on that one?
Well, I was kind of getting at the plastics problem a little bit with that question, because I moved over here to Italy about a year ago. And prior to that, I was in the Peace Corps in Ethiopia. Well, I was living in California waiting out the COVID pandemic, but for a while. But the most painfully obvious thing to me, and it's so damaging to the planet, is the degree and the degree of plastics there are. And we all know, we've all seen, read, heard, all the documentaries and everything about how terrible plastics are, but yet nobody really wants to give them up, or maybe nobody can give them up. And a big problem, that this is just my own observation, is that in a consumer society, which, Ethiopia, where I served in the Peace Corps, is trying hard to be a consumer society. And here in Italy, where in 30 years, they've gone from truly the slow food movement to not so sure now, supermarkets everywhere, everything is prepackaged in plastic. Where does it end? I was under the impression, and I think a lot of people are, that the Europeans are way ahead of the US in addressing these issues, but I'm not so sure, because it's not what I see here.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I feel like, unfortunately, it's really a global problem, right? In a sense, if you just look at sheer populations, the US and Europe are tiny compared to the rest of the world. And so if we're really looking at managing a pollution issue, then we really have to take sort of a global stance on it. And at this point, there are actually a lot of really positive effects of using plastics in applications where we haven't really been able to have structurally sound materials before. That's not necessarily the waste that we're seeing pile up, right? There's actually a really great company that's based out of Kenya, I believe, that is looking at taking all the plastics that we can't recycle, right? So PET, for example, is a really good use case for how we've done recycling right? We really know how to recycle water bottles really well. A lot of other plastics, not so much. And so there's a lot of plastic pollution that's coming up from these softer plastics, these types of plastics that are potentially contaminated and that don't really have a home and are ultimately either being burned or dumped in landfills or taking up quite a bit of space in our oceans now. So what this company is doing is actually working with a proprietary chemical formula to actually stabilize the plastics and turn it into building blocks. So they're replacing concrete, which of course has its own sort of very long supply chain issues when it comes to sand, when it comes to how it's produced, where it comes from, all of that, and is building affordable housing. I believe they just were speaking to the mayor of a large city in the region, which I don't think has been disclosed yet, so I won't say more, but is building quite a bit of affordable housing units in the area, which I think is really, really exciting and a really great application in an area where, of course, has more housing needs, but also where potentially getting access to a material like concrete would be prohibitively expensive, and tackling the plastic pollution issues. So I do think we're starting to see more innovative ways to tackle the plastic problem. A good friend of mine heads up the plastics initiative for, I believe, ocean plastics at the United Nations Environmental Program based out of Nairobi in Kenya. And there was just a large sort of consortium of countries that had come together in Korea last year and are really talking about the issue of recycling is, of course, a big part of what we need, but we also need to sort of stop the production, right? The metaphor or the example he gives is, if your house is flooding, the first thing you do is turn off the tap, right? You don't start taking buckets and taking the water out of your house. You first need to turn off the tap. And that's something that we haven't really done yet. So I think that is one of the biggest issues and that's to be honest, is a part of where we come in, is how can we replace plastics with better materials in some of these supply chains, in addition to recycling them effectively.
Well, and we see and hear about lots of new sort of interventions, such as what you describe in Kenya, but like, where are they? Where are they in the developed world, let alone the not so developed world? And that's where I mean, I realize governments cannot solve every problem, but oh my gosh, this just seems like something they could get their hands around, especially if there is a technology available that would, make these plastics useful instead of what they are.
Yep, exactly.
So one more question before we wind things down. You've got this very interesting set of personal experiences that brought you to being a part of SNØCAP. I mean, it's an interesting combination of your of your resume to bring those pieces together and be like, here's somebody for SNØCAP. That makes sense. One of those pieces is having run for Congress. And I believe that out of a crowded field, you took third in a situation where only the top two would go forward. So you made some real headway there. What did you learn from the experience that is now informing your work with SNØCAP?
Yeah, it's been quite a ride this past year. And I think one of the most important takeaways is sort of goes along the lines of something that I shared earlier, which is that the only way we're going to tackle this problem is if it is top of mind, if we make it a priority, if we get out and vote, if we put our money where our mouth is, if we make sure that we're investing in the solutions that we actually need. And I think that's a big part of what my campaign was. I ran on a really strong climate platform. And I think we need more people to really bring this issue top of mind and not have it be something that we're going to deal with, 50 years from now, but something that we can really start building the systems for today to tackle. So there's, I think, a lot to unpack in terms of the role of government, in terms of how we're communicating about issues that are really affecting all of us, but in particular generations to come, and the responsibility that we have today to take that on. So.
Well, kudos for jumping in that space and being willing to serve. I am going to wind things down, and then, as we always do, we'll hand it back to our speaker for the final word. All of you joining us as a part of the live recording now, or if you are watching this recording on YouTube or our SiliconValleyRotary.com page, thank you for spending your time learning about the things that we love to explore along the way as well. Two things we'd ask you to do. One is that if you are on the SiliconValleyRotary.com page and scroll down just a little farther, there's an attendance form, and you can let us know you are here. And we love getting a sense of the reach that these programs have. Please let us know. If you are a visiting Rotarian and wanted to get an email to your secretary about having made up a miss with us, that will accomplish that as well. Farther down the page, you'll find our forum, Discuss, DISQUS, and you can leave comments there about this program or any element of the meeting. You can respond to what others have said as well. It is a beautifully interesting and civil space to be able to share and agree and disagree and whatever that might be. But to do so is something important for an online and asynchronous service club such as ours. As we always like to do, we hand it back to our speaker for the final word. Shrina, what would you like people to have in mind as they finish off this video?
Yeah, well, thank you again for having me. I think the big takeaway for me, especially with what I'm doing now, is from research to policy to tech, what we're missing across the board is the ability to scale. Right? I've built and advised companies, I've invested at the early stage, ran for US Congress to try to bridge these gaps. But at this critical point in time, we have an unprecedented opportunity, especially with the latest injection of capital from the federal government, to actually fight climate change and to build a more sustainable economy. So I hope you will join us in that journey.
Wonderful. Thank you, Shrina. Thank you, everyone. We will see you next week.